The greatest bank heist in history is happening now. Throughout history, robbers and criminals have targeted the banks to, of course, steal their money. These days, the criminals have gotten much more sophisticated and have worked their way inside the government and banking system. You know, the 2008 Great Financial Crash was bad for millions of people around the world, but you might not know it was also one of the largest bank heists in history. And as bad as it was, it's only getting worse and at an accelerating pace. So in this video, I will break down what really happened in 2008. Hint, it wasn't because you bought too much house. I will explain what the bankers did. I'll break down the amount of money they embezzled. And just wait, because you won't believe it. I'm going to break down how it was only the beginning, how it's getting worse and worse, what really happened in 2020, how the central bankers are planning to reset the system, and most importantly, how you should be protecting yourself from the out-of-control central bankers. So let's go. All right, welcome back. If you're new to the channel, my name is Mark Moss, and I make these videos to change the way you think about money because almost everything you have learned is wrong, and it's not your fault. The schools haven't taught you, and even worse, the information has been withheld from you, and even you've been lied to. So that's okay. I'm going to break it down for you. I'm going to show you what the real information is, and when I found out just a few weeks ago, I was completely shocked, and I know you will be as well. Now, how do you survive? How do you thrive in an era where all the information you get is wrong? Well, one of the ways is to get the accurate data. The world is changing fast. I say the world we're going into is not the same as the world we've left behind, and so you need to learn how to adapt. It's exactly why I'm having the Market Disruptors Live Conference. It's a live event. I have about 15 of the top speakers, top analysts in the world from all different disciplines coming to tell you what they think is going to happen over the next couple of years, and most importantly, what you should be doing to not just survive, but to thrive. I'm talking about Danielle DiMartino Booth, a real Fed insider. I'm talking about my good buddy, George Gammon. I'm talking about Luke Grauman, so many more. There's a link down below, marketdisruptorslive.com. Check it out. Come, make new friends, build some community, talk to me, the other speakers, get your strategy down so you can be one of the ones to really survive and thrive through this coming change. All right, now back to the topic at hand. All right, now to understand this story, how the bankers ran off with the largest bank heist in history, we have to go back a little bit in time. So let's jump all the way back to the 2008 Great Financial Crash, when the global financial system crashed and the Federal Reserve had to bail out the banks, which was a massive slap in the face to how we thought capitalism was supposed to work, at least in the US. Now, it will possibly be known as one of the darkest days for the US that signaled the rapid decline of the US empire. The Wall Street hedge funds and the greedy bankers, they had their massive losses socialized and paid for by the taxpayer in what was the largest banking bailout at the time. Now we're talking about the $700 billion TARP bailout program. Now I know $700 billion may seem small in today's world of bailouts and stimulus programs, but in 2008, I remember it clearly. I could not believe what they were doing. This was the first of its kind, and in 2008, a very, very controversial decision to make. Now, the narrative sold to the public was that the American homeowners got too greedy, right? They were buying too many houses, and they were responsible for the crash. Yeah, right. As if you and I could swing the entire financial market enough to crash the whole system. Now, it wasn't the greedy homeowners buying too much home that was responsible, but rather it was the bankers speculating in the financial markets, creating financial products out of mortgages called MBS, or mortgage-backed securities. They were repackaging them, selling them over and over, and that's what caused this. All right, but that's a whole nother story. I can go into it another time if you want. Leave me a comment down below. But the everyday person was left bankrupt by the housing market decline in 2008, and they didn't receive the same bailout that the over-leveraged bankrupt banks received from the government. And the American people got mad, rightly so, and it ignited protests, which is now infamously known as the Occupy Wall Street protest. Now, these protests weren't some fringe alt-right group either, right? These protests represented the views of most everyday hardworking Americans. Many polls have been done in the aftermath of the enormous bailout, and most polls reflect the majority of Americans didn't agree with the decision taken to bail out the big banks. Now, the American people were pissed off, and rightly so, because the big banks got a bailout when they made risky bets that crashed the whole system, but the same bailout wasn't extended to you and me. But what if we weren't told the whole story? What if it's worse than any of our wildest dreams? Now, the Fed itself claims the bailouts that occurred between 2007 and 2011 was only, I say only, about 1.2 trillion in size. Now, that's what they'll admit to, but let's be honest, who really trusts the central bankers? Now, it literally took an act of Congress and a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit by Bloomberg to get Ben Bernanke to finally release more information about the Fed's actions. Now, what was revealed by the lawsuit shows exactly why the Fed fought so hard to hide it, and you won't believe what was discovered. According to Bloomberg, the estimated numbers, the real size of the bailout was actually 7.7 trillion in size, not the 1.2 trillion the Fed claimed. Incredible, right? Now, what if the amount of money created from thin air by the Fed to bail out the banks was actually even more than that? Well, that's exactly what happened. A research report led by economist L. Randall Wray found that the extent of the 2008 Great Financial Crash was way bigger. It was way bigger than anyone would have ever believed or has even heard about in the mainstream media. Wray and a pair of PhD students at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, tried to assess the total size of the Fed's interventions. Not just the loans made, but asset purchases as well. They concluded that the bailout wasn't 1.2 trillion. It wasn't even the 7.7 trillion, but shockingly in excess of 29 trillion. What? 29 trillion. Now, with such a massive number, it's strange we didn't hear about it in the mainstream press, right? Almost like it's gotten swept under the carpet, right? Now, as we can see by the chart, the report conducted by the team was very thorough and was able to pinpoint where all the money went. So, where did the money go? Well, the report shows that it was the largest banks in America that received the majority of the bailout money from the Fed. And what do you think these banks did with all that newfound money? Well, they made trillions of dollars profit from the bailouts they received, of course. Bloomberg estimates that the big banks made a massive $13 billion in profit on the enormous money they received at 0.01% interest rate from the Federal Reserve. So at 0.01%, I mean, that's basically free money, right? Now, at the height of the crisis on December 5th, 2008, the large banks needed to borrow $1.2 trillion in emergency liquidity from the Fed on a single day. That's over $1 trillion in a single day at nearly 0% interest. Hey, sign me up. Where can I get that 0% interest? I'll take a trilly. Just add it to my tab, right? Well, unfortunately, it's not for you and I, but during the economic crisis, the 6 largest banks in the U.S. actually saw their assets grow from $6.8 trillion in 2006 to over $9.5 trillion in 2011. These banks somehow managed to grow their wealth during one of the hardest economic times for the everyday average person, when millions of Americans were losing their homes and going bankrupt. I consider this to be straight up theft. This is embezzlement, which the literal definition is misappropriation of funds placed in one's trust, which embezzlement's a crime in the United States, of course. That is for you and I that are subject to, things like laws. And no one understands how big the theft is. Now, I just sort of threw out the 29 trillion, and today you're used to hearing, trillions being thrown around like it's nothing. But let's put this into some perspective for you. First off, in 2008, the bailout of the financial system was only $700 billion, and that was enough to get people in the streets protesting. So from $700 billion to $29 trillion, It's only a meager 41 times larger. Now, for some comparisons here, 29 trillion is almost double the entire yearly US GDP of 14.5 trillion. That's right, the entire US economy would have to work and produce goods for free for 2 years to bail out the financial system in 2008. Now, it's bad enough these bankers embezzled 29 trillion from the system to enrich themselves, but it's even worse than that. Besides directly stealing from you, it also pushed asset prices higher, which means your cost of living, or your cost to get in the game, it went up. Home prices are back above all-time highs. Stock prices are at near all-time highs. Gold, oil, you name it. So how are the young people supposed to get into the game? And why are all these asset prices at all-time highs? Oh yeah, it's the money. It's the money the bankers embezzled from the system and dumped into the assets. And just like a late-night TV infomercial, just wait, there's more. Now, you obviously know the markets crashed hard in March of 2020, right? When the entire global economy was shut down. And of course, the markets crashed when that happened, just like when the entire banking system crashed in 2008. And it was because the greedy homeowners. Yeah, right. Now, would you believe me if I told you the market crash of March 2020 actually started in September of 2019, long before the pandemic was even a word you had heard or used? Now, the banking system actually seized up, literally froze up overnight when interest rates in the overnight repo market soared to 10%, a level not seen since the 2008 global financial crisis. In fact, in the last quarter of 2019, before there was any news of, the COVID or the pandemic, the Fed had already pumped 4.5 trillion into the banking repo markets to unnamed trading houses on Wall Street. The Fed's emergency repo loan operations began on September 17, 2019, and from September 17, 2019 through the last acknowledged operation on July 2, 2020, the Fed's repo loans cumulatively totaled $11.23 trillion. And the Fed becomes even more interesting because Jerome Powell was very adamant at the time that the financial system was very healthy in late 2019, and the repo market hadn't had a flare-up in over 10 years since the great financial crash. But the expansion of the Fed's balance sheet in late 2019 was a leading indicator of what came next. And once again, it was the banks that caused the financial system to seize up and crash the markets. Now, in early 2022, the Federal Reserve quietly released the names of the banks that received these loans. And it was the same old names, the same old offenders, causing the same old problems. Of the largest borrowers were JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, and Citigroup, three of the Wall Street banks that were at the center of the subprime and derivatives crisis back in 2008 that brought down the U.S. economy. Now, these are some of the largest banks in America and around the world that desperately needed emergency liquidity in the repo markets. Okay, so what's next? Well, what the bankers have done in the best case is embezzled, or really just straight up ripped us off. And of course, they don't want you, the public, to find out about this. And also because the debt levels are unsustainable and the markets can't be propped up any longer, what can you do? Well, when you've run out of moves on the game board, you have to reset the game. We've talked more about the unsustainability of the financial system and why I think we're close to an economic reset in this recent video that we'll put up here. And when we looked at where we stand in reference to the 80-year long-term debt cycle, and despite good old Janet Yellen claiming that we'd never see another financial crisis in our lifetimes, our governments have been quietly preparing for the next crisis and the associated embezzlement that would come with it. For example, let's look at an economic paper titled The Liquidation of Government Debt, written by the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements, in 2011. In it, they accurately compared current debt levels around the world to the World War II era and also highlight how inflation and financial repression was successfully used to deleverage that huge government debt 80 years ago. Then we also have a 2019 BlackRock paper titled Dealing with the Next Downturn. And in it, BlackRock outlines how in the next crisis, policymakers would have to use helicopter money and enable the, quote, independent central banks to partner with governments to combine fiscal and monetary policy. Now, almost prophetically, this is exactly what happened around the world in early 2020 in response to the repo market crisis and the yield curve inversion of late 2019. Almost as if policymakers followed the BlackRock playbook. Now, all policymakers need is the right excuse to execute their plans to reset the system. So, is this why we always seem to be at war? Wars have been great for creating inflation and artificially high economic activity, and they're very useful to distract the masses from what's occurring behind the curtains. Now remember, high inflation and currency devaluation is generally how governments choose to default on debt when they're faced with a gigantic 130% debt to GDP threshold. Now, all governments need to execute this deleveraging is the right distraction and the right narrative to justify their debasement. It all goes back to the bread and circuses quote. With debt levels at World War II wartime levels, do the policymakers need the appearance of a war? Do they need the appearance of a war to enable them to embark on a wartime financing policy to shrink their debt? In the 1940s, during the massive government deleveraging, they justified the high inflation as a necessary to fight the Second World War. It was the American people's patriotic duty to buy war bonds that were losing 15% of purchasing power per year. Now, many believe the inflationary monetary policies exercised in the 1940s was all about fighting World War II, when in reality, it was a perfect opportunity for the government to deleverage and recapitalize their balance sheet. Now, it appears as though the same is happening today, as we continue to watch the never-ending wars being used as a scapegoat for other endeavors, which is becoming a more frequent occurrence in the 20th and even into the 21st century. Sadly, this banking scandal of 2008 wasn't a once-off mistake that our policymakers have made. Could it be possible that we're living through the reset as we speak? Now, in the short term, there's only one way to protect yourself from these out-of-control central bankers trying to loot the system and then reset the whole thing. That is, get rid of that fake fiat counterfeit currency. That is, get rid of the fake fiat counterfeit currency and buy real things, hard assets, things that cannot be artificially created. This is why the commodity markets are blowing up right now. Real things with real scarcity, like land, like oil, like energy, like gold, and like Bitcoin. Hard assets, that's what you want to buy at a time when we have fake fiat currency being printed at a never-ending pace. But what are you doing to protect yourself? I'd like to hear. Leave me a comment down below and let me know what you're doing to protect yourself from the out-of-control central bankers and the $29 trillion they are looting from the system right now. Also, don't forget to check out the marketdisruptorslive.com event. There's a link down below. Join me and about 15 of the top speakers in the world to let you know what they think is going to happen and what you should be doing about it. Don't miss this event. It's the second annual Market Disruptors Live event. That's what I got for you today, all right? Give me a thumbs up on this video if you like it. If you don't like the video, give me a thumbs down, but at least leave me a comment and let me know why. And that's it. To your success. I'm out.